Hello dear chess friends, this is Mateusz Kołasowski, an international master from Poland, and I would like to welcome you to this new video that I've recorded in cooperation with. And the topic of this clip is how to complicate the game. Perhaps before we start going through the game itself, I should make a little bit of an introduction. The game I've picked to show you here is taken from the relatively recent tournament played in Tbilisi 2017. This is the World Cup, and the game itself is a very high caliber game played between Levon Aronian of Armenia and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave from France. Both of these players, as you know, are capable of showing extremely high quality games. They play very entertaining chess, and both of them used to be 2,800 players. At this point their ratings dropped, but nevertheless they are still considered to be one of the best players nowadays. And the game itself is taken from their final match in the World Cup. And as a matter of fact, at the point of playing this game, Levon Aronian already needed a win with white in order to stay in the match. And since, of course, he wanted to win the entire competition, he had to win the game and he had to take some risks. And this is why I've decided to show you this particular game. And I believe that the background itself is actually quite an important factor in this game. So the game went d4, knight f6, c4, g6, f3. This is an attempt to steer the game into some Zemish type positions, the Zemish variation of King's Indian. Of course, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave is known to be a very good greenfield player, and as you know, greenfield is a type of an opening where even though both players have their respective chances, if black is well prepared, it is difficult for white to achieve anything special. And of course, Vachier-Lagrave is considered to be an expert in this opening, and I believe that this is why f3 was played by Levon here. Of course, it's possible to play d5, knight c6, e5. There is a huge variety of interesting moves, but the French player decided to opt for c5. d5, d6, knight c3, e6, e4, bishop g7, knight g2. And as a matter of fact, this is a position very typical for King's Indian Zemish variation, and also for the Benoni types of structures. So in such positions, both players usually decide to castle kingside. White may want to play knight g3 first, then bishop e2. Of course, he needs to develop his kingside pieces. At some point, black may be interested in playing a6 followed by b5 in order to get this sort of a Bencott type of counterplay, and in the meantime white is just enjoying his space advantage in the center. Great many plans, great many ideas, and definitely an entertaining and quite complex game is approaching. So Vachier-Lagrave decided to castle. Knight g3, a6. So of course now black intends to play b5, or first perhaps take on d5 with the pawn, and usually white recaptures with the c pawn, and then b5 could be played with an idea to get some space on the queen side. So for example, if Levon played a move like bishop e3, which is not the move that he did, played in the game, then e takes d5 looks pretty interesting. Of course, we don't want to take with the e-pawn because then black plays rook e8 and actually makes a very annoying pin on the bishop on e3. So instead, most likely c takes d5, but that would be met with b5. and at some point it might be important that black has the ability to play b4 and make pressure on white's king side, especially that this bishop on g7 is an extremely important piece, and its impact on white's queen side cannot be underestimated. So that is actually quite a typical plan, but still it is very it can prove to be very dangerous, and it's better to avoid it if possible. So instead of bishop e3, Aronian went for a4, and this looks like a very natural idea. Of course, b5 is going to be met with 8 takes b5. So instead, Vachier played h5, and this is another typical idea in both Zamish King's Indian and in Benoni types of in Benoni structures. With the knight on g3, black basically intends to play h4 and force white to sort of take some time in order to consolidate and in order to make to get proper development. So for instance, if bishop e2, which I believe is actually quite an important resource, black can play h4, and after knight f1, white usually plays then plays knight d2. He pretty much needs to do that, and then only then he can castle. Unfortunately for white, there is a nice subtlety here, because usually this maneuver is actually quite efficient once those e6 and c pawns are gone. So if white is able to play knight d2 and then plant the knight to c4, which is generally the dream position for the knight, then he's going to be more or less okay. He's going to be actually, I think, enjoying his position quite a lot. But with the pawn still on c4, this maneuver is simply off the table, and it's actually quite problematic for white to finish his development quickly. So h5 doesn't really create any weaknesses in black's position, perhaps apart from the g5 square, and it also may make white's life a little bit more difficult. So instead of playing the normal developing bishop e2 move, Levon went for bishop g5. This looks like a very logical continuation. In fact, it's a normal developing move, so why not? There was queen c7, so as you see, Vachier-Lagrave is still postponing opening the center with e takes d5, c takes d5, so we might assume that he wanted to outsmart Levon in some way. Perhaps not showing the intention at the moment was a way to trick Aronian, to maybe the delaying exchange on d5 would help him in one of the lines. There was queen d2, and after queen d2 the intention of Aronian is actually quite clear. He wants to play bishop h6. This is a very typical idea. Bishop h6 would force black to exchange dark squared bishops, and then the bishop on g7 would not be such a strong piece, which usually makes black's position good and playable because of the potential pressure along the long diagonal. There was e takes d5, c takes d5, and knight h7. This actually invites bishop h6, but after bishop h6, Vachier-Lagrave had something in mind. There was bishop h6, h4, bishop g7, king g7, and now this is a very important position of the entire game, because the typical and logically looking knight e2 could actually prove to be something that Vachier-Lagrave was ready to meet. Definitely, the bishop on f1 is a massive problem for white. So even though black has slightly exposed himself on king side. His king is not as safe as it used to be. h4 pawn can also prove to be a target later on in the game, but for the time being, I don't believe white has enough time to start even thinking about capturing this pawn. Also, after knight e2, black may have enough active counterplay, so in fact he might start thinking about playing a move like f5. After all, the white king is still on e1, so opening the position could generally prove to be a smart idea. If this is too risky, then even just bringing the rest of the pieces into the action would be okay. Knight bd7 followed by knight e5 seems to be a very natural continuation. And of course, in the meantime, white still needs to solve his problems with consolidating. Queenside castle is of course off the table because white is just too exposed on queenside. So he pretty much needs to play knight f4 or knight c1 and then play bishop e2, and only then he can castle. So of course that is at least 3 moves. And if black manages to find a way to slow white down, then perhaps he will even have to spend more time on getting a playable position with white. And remember that at this point Aronian really needed to win the game. So he actually thought that knight e2 is the move that Vachier-Lagrave is well prepared for, and he wanted to deal with his problems in a positional fashion. So he wanted to make sure that he's going to be able to castle kingside without slowing down himself, and for that reason he picked a very non-standard and outstanding way to approach this position. I strongly recommend that you take some time and think about this position on your own, because you're going to take the most out of this course if you just try to find the moves on your own. So feel free to pause the video at any point of the game and just try to find the right move. And for those of you who don't want to do that, or who already know what their answers would be, the move that Aronian played is actually bishop c4, an outstanding move. As I said, developing the bishop itself is a very simple move, but once your knight is hanging, you don't really even consider such a move to be played. The entire point is that after h takes g3, h takes g3, h5 gets open, and in fact, if Vachier-Lagrave is not going to be precise, he might even get checkmated, as queen h6 is just a massive threat. Of course, this still doesn't mean that black is lost or anything like that, but this is a brilliant way to complicate the game. Have a look at black's kingside. At this point, none of these pieces have been developed, and even though we might argue that the bishop on c8 is quite an active piece, the rest of the pieces highlighted in red are actually doing pretty much nothing. And this is why this sacrifice is, if not fully justified, then at least partly. And of course, the alternatives do not look that great for Vachier-Lagrave, because if he doesn't take on g3, then Aronian is just going to get back on e2 with the knight at any point he wishes to. And then positionally he's more solid, and I believe that in long run he will have better prospects. Of course, he has his pieces more active. His king will always remain safer than the black counterpart. And of course, in long run, f4, e5, typical Benoni ideas would work just fine, I think. So Vachier-Lagrave decided that, okay, even though it's going to be very risky, he needs to take that risk in order to balance the game. So he took the knight, h takes g3, rook h8, this is the only move. And now queen h6 looks like a very good continuation, but Aronian decided to make things even more spicy and he played another beautiful move, or if not beautiful, then at least extremely interesting, and making the position even more chaotic, because chaos is exactly what Aronian needed at this point. He could not afford himself to get a simple position with Vachier-Lagrave having a straight way to equalize the position, or at least make it under his control. So again, feel free to pause the video, and the move that Aronian made can be justified in a very simple way. I'm not sure if you know or remember the principles regarding attacking the king in general. One of the principles says that we need to bring as many pieces as possible into the action. And this is exactly what Aronian did. He thought that the knight on c3 is doing pretty much nothing here, and maneuvering it to kingside would take him too much time. So he could have played knight e2, knight f4, or knight d1, knight e3, knight g4, but this is very time consuming and looks ineffective at all. So instead, he thought that the quicker way to do that would be to play e5. And such a pawn break is a very typical idea for Benoni structure, for King's Indian Zemish as well. But here it looks even more impressive because the knight is just heading towards e4 in the very next move. It doesn't look like Vachier could afford himself to take this pawn for tactical reasons, because after d takes e5, what happens is actually d6. Queen goes somewhere, for example to d8, then queen h6 comes. King f6 would of course be a horrible idea because black gets checkmated like that. And in case of king g8, queen g6, king f8, queen f7, sorry, not bishop, of course, queen f7. We don't want to allow black to escape. So that would be a horrific way to end the game. So instead, Vachier brought his queen a little bit closer to kingside. He played queen e7. And now, again, it was possible to play f4, it was possible to play queen h6, but no, we need to bring more pieces to the action. Now it's all about attacking. So queenside castle. The rook from d1 can easily and quickly get introduced to the attack, and that's definitely a good idea. Knight d7 was played, e takes d6, queen takes d6, and knight e4, queen e5, and now again, the position requires us to play in a very forceful way, meaning that we need to bring as many resources as possible, because otherwise black consolidates, and if he consolidates he will have enough pieces to defend himself. So black wants to play knight f6 or knight f8, then perhaps bring the bishop from c8. If he achieves that, then we're just going to be down a piece. As long as black has some problems on queenside, and as long as we keep initiative going on, this is a promising position. So now the worst piece in our position is the bishop on c4, therefore d6. As previously, the threat is to play queen h6, followed by queen takes g6, and this is another moment when Vachier-Lagrave had a very, very difficult position. And at this point it was crucial for him to find a move that looks quite passive. Knight d to f8 seems to be the best choice, and after queen h6, king g8, as you see, the knight from f8 protects the pawn on g6. Is this a pleasant position for black? Well, definitely not, but from practical point of view and objectively, this was simply the only way to proceed in this position. Please note that this is approximately equal, but from practical point of view, it's extremely difficult for the player who first of all needs to defend a position like that. And remember the psychological factor of this game. So Vachier, of course, he wasn't forced to draw that game because he still losing the game itself would not mean that he loses the entire match, but I'm pretty sure that he was already sort of anticipating that he could hold this game and just win the entire competition. And therefore, finding defensive moves, precise move after precise move, was extremely difficult for him. And he did make a mistake. He played g5, exposing the light squares. Of course, that prevents queen h6, so we might sort of understand his intention, but this was not good enough. And now another move that Aronian made is also a sign of really high quality chess. Even though h-file is open, now the rook on h1 is not as powerful as it was, because queen h6 is not a threat anymore. Therefore, we're bringing the rook to the center by means of rook h to e1. The x-ray created on e-file is again very awkward to meet, and again this required a lot of precision from Vachier-Lagrave, but the position at this point is already, if not lost, then very difficult. b5 was played, so an attempt to get some counterplay, logical way to deal with this position. Bishop d5, rook b8, f4. Of course, we need to play aggressively, because otherwise black gets his own play and he manages to neutralize our attack. And queen d4 was played. This is a decisive mistake of the game. The only way here to proceed was to play queen f5, but I assume that this was also very counterintuitive for Vachier-Lagrave, because when you look at queen f5, it seems that even a move like rook f1 followed by f takes g5 is something you're not going to be happy with. Additionally, it looked like f4 was an attempt to fight for this long diagonal c3 h8, and queen d4 was a move which, of course, well, offers an exchange of the queens, as it attacks the pawn on a4, keeps the c3 square under control. But what Vachier-Lagrave missed is that after queen d4, queen e2, queen b4, Aronian is able to provide a decisive attack and again switch his pieces to kingside, and the game was actually concluded by means of queen h5. The whole point is that after rook f8, which seems to be the only way to deal with queen f7 threat, after rook f8 we have enough time to bring the rook back to h1. Black is still not threatening our king in any way, and in the meantime queen h7 is simply going to finish the game. If knight f6, then both knight takes f6 looks convincing, but also we can just play, I'm pretty sure we can play queen h6. If king h8, we can just take this knight, because the knight on h7 is pinned. If king g8, well, we can just take on f6 with a check, so everything comes by force. And there was not a single moment when Vachier-Lagrave could breathe without feeling that something dangerous is going to happen in a moment. Beautiful display of forcing chess, aggressive chess by Levon Aronian. This game enabled him to stay in the game, stay in the match, and eventually win the entire trophy. So I believe this is how you want to complicate the game, how you want to put your opponent under pressure. And remember that it's, from practical point of view, it's always more difficult to defend than to attack. So even if you're making a mistake when attacking, the worst consequence for you is that, well, you're going to lose some material or allow your opponent to equalize the position. Whereas whenever you're defending, usually checkmate is the prize. So this is how you want to attack, this is how you want to make things complex, and I really enjoyed this game. I hope you also enjoyed it. and thanks for watching this.